Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, co-host, husband. And today we are talking through a topic that has been coming up in the DMs quite a bit lately. And that is, I want to talk a little bit more about the Dutch test. This is something that I shared a little bit about in some recent content. We talked through a little bit of some of my own personal experiences with getting a Dutch test. And I started getting a lot of questions from people. Why would you choose a Dutch test over blood work? Like, what is the value in it? Would this be helpful for me in my certain situation? Like, a lot of things coming up. So I felt like maybe it would be a good time to bring in a full podcast episode about it.
Yeah, I think honestly, if just kind of going back in the last year or two that you've had through your own hormone journey, hormone healing journey, I think a lot of people don't even know about the Dutch test period. And they're like, blood work is the only way to go. And I think it just confuses people and it keeps people stuck. So I'm excited to kind of chat a little bit more about it. And if anything, just bring your perspective, bring more clarity to our listeners and see how we can help them along the way.
Yeah. So I think I actually only had my first Dutch test back in 2022, I think the beginning of 2022, when I first was starting to explore a little bit deeper into my own hormone health. And it was something that was recommended to me at the time. And it was something I was a little bit familiar with, but didn't know that much about.
Yeah.
But that was what caused me to really start to dive into learning more and more about it. And today it is the test that we most commonly order for our own clients. So what is the Dutch test? For those who don't know, it is a at-home dried urine test. So Dutch itself, it's not referring to Dutch as a language.
I always thought it did. That's what I was going to ask. I was like, oh, is this thing European?
No, Dutch is an acronym. It stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones. And that's exactly what it is. So like I said, it's an at-home test, and it's something that is really, really incredible and really has become huge in specifically more the functional health industry, but even has become more mainstream now with a little bit more Western medicine. Doctors have even started recommending it. So people are becoming more and more familiar with it. But anytime something becomes more popular and more familiar, I think then you also have people start to come from the other side of saying like, oh, there's too much hype. It's overhyped. It's not worth it, because obviously it's going to be something that is going to be more expensive. The more effective something is, typically the more expensive it will be. And so, of course, there's going to be the haters around the Dutch test.
Well, I think too, and I think this is just the internet, just the resources that we have these days, but everybody has a different opinion. So I'm sure you're going to find somebody that's going to be very pro Dutch and then somebody that's going to be very against it. And again, if you are honest, I think everybody has a little bit of bias because they're trying to push different supplements or, whatever. But one quick story I wanted to share. I remember the first time you did a Dutch test and I went to the bathroom and there's all these pee strips and I was like, what the hell is going on? And then of course I asked and I was like, okay, I'm definitely not touching that because it's your pee. But yeah, I think it's cool that it gives you that availability to do it at your own home, at your own pace. So I don't know. To me, I think it's really cool.
Yeah. And so I want to even kind of take the angle with this episode of comparing a Dutch test to getting blood work, because I think that's the most common question that comes up is, well, what's the difference between me getting a Dutch test versus me just going to the doctor and asking for blood work? And so, I mean, there's a lot of different things that we can hit on, but there's a few main things I want to address here. Not necessarily one of them, but kind of Omar starting to mention there too. Because it is an at-home test, because it is a dried urine test, very easy. You're just literally peeing on a strip of paper and letting it dry out and then mailing it back.
It's like a science experiment, I think.
Yeah. But because of that, it actually is favorable even for a lot of people who just don't like having their blood drawn. I've had clients or people express before too of like, man, I hate needles. I hate having my blood drawn. And so this is amazing. I don't even have to leave my house. I don't have to have a needle in me. Like, this is wonderful. And so for a lot of people, they just appreciate it for that reason alone. But that is just like the tip of the iceberg for why a Dutch test is advantageous for testing hormones compared to blood work. So the Dutch test itself, so like we said, this stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones. So what does that necessarily mean?
Break that down, yeah.
Yeah, how comprehensive is this?
How Dutch is it?
So with a Dutch test, you're going to look at your sex hormones and as well as how they're being detoxed, the different pathways they're taking. You're going to be able to look at adrenal hormones. So we're looking at cortisol, cortisone, the different cortisol metabolites. We're looking at cortisol patterning. So again, we're not just looking at one point in the day. We're able to see the pattern over the course of the day. We're looking at neurotransmitter metabolites. We're looking at oxidative stress markers, nutritional organic acids. Like there's a lot of really valuable stuff in the Dutch test itself, which can give a lot of really great information for somebody who is either dealing with some type of health issue. They may not even be aware that it's a health issue. It might just show up for them as I cannot lose weight no matter what I do. Or I just am so tired these days and I didn't used to be this tired. Or I feel like I get really bad PMS around my cycle. Or I just don't feel my best anymore.
Can I throw one in there? The one that I've gotten lately too is women that are like, hey, I just wake up at like 2 a.m. for no reason at all, and I just cannot go to sleep. And then the next day, I'm just exhausted all the time. Excuse me. Exhausted all the time during the day. Like I feel like I could nap all day, every single day. They're like, I basically like my day and nights has like been inverted. Like what the hell is going on? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dutch is really giving you so much information that can really help you go so much further than what you will be able to get from just looking at blood work when you go to your doctor's office. So like I said, the Dutch test, it does look at hormones, but it doesn't just look at, okay, what's free and available in your blood. So like if you go to the doctor and they have you get some blood work done, what's going to happen is what you're just looking at is the actual hormone that's free and available in the blood at the time that blood is drawn, essentially. Well, with a Dutch test, because it's a urine sample, we're not just seeing what was free and available. We're actually able to see how it was processed through the body, essentially, how it was metabolized, how it's broken down, and what pathways it's actually detoxed through. And that might sound like a bunch of like mumbo jumbo to some people of like, what does that even mean? But all you really need to know is that is very important information when it comes to these types of symptoms that may not even be showing up as anything alarming in your blood work. So, I mean, like Omar, how often do we have consultation calls where women will say, I am feeling this and that and all these different things. And I went to my doctor, I asked them to, check my hormones, and the doctor pulled the blood work and then they said, everything looks great. Everything's normal. You're good to go. Nothing is wrong with you. Maybe you just need to sleep more. Maybe you just need to lose weight. Maybe you just need to exercise more. Like that's all they tell me.
Right.
Nothing is going on for them according to their blood work. Well, then we dive in with a Dutch test and we can find a lot is actually happening.
So correct me if I'm wrong, and just to make sure that both the listeners and myself are kind of understanding correctly. So it sounds like with a blood drawn sample, you can just see what, again, is in your body, in your blood at that particular period, versus with a Dutch, you can see almost like a bigger overview of not only what is in your urine, but also how it's being processed, how it's being metabolized, how your body's, pathways and everything are kind of impacting it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, essentially. So like, for example, estrogen. That's actually, when we refer to the estrogen hormone, there's actually 3 different hormones, essentially. We just kind of blanket it all under estrogen.
Okay. So this is what you were trying to teach me the other day, right?
Yep. So okay. I was showing him
we
my
were
Dutch
at dinner.
test.
I was like, maybe let's save this for the podcast.
Yep. So we actually have 3 different, essentially, like types of estrogen. There's specific names, like you can even think of it just E1, E2, E3.
Okay.
And so now when we have these different types of estrogen, there's certain ones that like we want to be at certain levels. And then there's also essentially different pathways that they detox through. And there's like these 3 different pathways to where one of them is the one that we kind of want things to go down. Another one is actually very commonly associated with cancer. So that can be one of like, if you are heavily going down that pathway, you could be getting ahead of future health problems because you could be almost looking at, okay, you might be prone for cancer down the road. Like we know that estrogen dominance can actually put somebody more at risk for breast cancer. So also being able to identify, your estrogen's taking that detox pathway, again, you're more at risk for cancer down the road. So that's another thing of like, man, we aren't even just solving what's currently happening. We can get ahead of future health issues.
Interesting.
And then another pathway is one that we see very commonly in our clients. And that one's super, super common with like certain PMS. And so a lot of women dealing with a lot of PMS issues, they'll typically find their estrogen is really going to heavily down that pathway. And so when we kind of get this information, essentially now what we can do is it's not just getting the information. It's not like, oh, I got my Dutch test results back. I saw that, my estrogen's taking that pathway. Cool. My life is great now. Everything's solved. I have more information. We all don't necessarily need more information. We need to know what to do with that information.
I think there's a shit ton of information. I didn't know if I was going to curse on that one or not, but I think there's information overload. It's more so how can we apply it to what we need and our bodies in particular.
Yep, exactly. And so when we have that kind of information, like specifically using the example of, okay, we know that your estrogen is more so going down that detox pathway. Well, guess what? Now it can be as simple as, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to use certain nutrition strategies. We're going to use specific supplements, and we're going to use a couple of different lifestyle habits to help your body start to push it towards this other detox pathway.
Got it. The way my mind is processing this right now, it's kind of like a traffic map, and your car is going in one direction and you need it to go another one. And it's like, okay, well now let's block this road and let's get your car to go this way to get it to the right pathway so that you can feel your best. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, sure.
That's, one way of looking at it. But ultimately, that's just one tiny little example. There is so much more within the Dutch test. It's super, super exciting for nerds like me who like to be able to dive deeper into things. But that's where, again, this can be super helpful for women who are experiencing almost like mystery symptoms where they don't really know what's causing them to feel depressed in that, week before their period. Or, okay, maybe they're aware that they're dealing with that, but they just don't even know what to actually do about it. Maybe they're just seeing different supplements where they're like, should I take that supplement? Should I eat this way that I saw somebody talk about on Instagram? Well, the reality is, and this can be the hard part about social media, is that if we're just going off of symptoms, you could show symptoms for 10 different things because there's so much crossover. Because if you're just going off of symptoms, then essentially now you might almost misdiagnose yourself to where you're saying, okay, well, according to Instagram, I have all these symptoms that show I have estrogen dominance. But then I also am I have these symptoms that are also showing maybe I have high cortisol. And then I have all these symptoms that are showing I have gut health issues. And you find yourself feeling incredibly overwhelmed. You don't really know what you actually are supposed to do about it. And then you're now being pushed these different supplements that are going to magically fix all these issues. But you feel even more overwhelmed because now you're taking 15 supplements and you don't even know if any of them are actually right for you.
And I mean, how often does that happen? I think that happens to
All
every
the time.
single person, or myself included, where I'm like, oh, I'm going to try this. And then I get so frustrated because I'm like, it's not that, it's not this. I've already tried that. And it's like, well, we're just trying different approaches, but it's not the right one for you. And I think that's the biggest thing to highlight.
Yeah, exactly. So it's once we know specifically, okay, maybe you were showing symptoms for high cortisol, but when we actually dove in, we saw that, your cortisol actually looked fine. It was actually more of an estrogen issue. Now we can specifically use the right supplementation for that. Because supplements can be incredible when they're used effectively, but they can also be, I think, not to say terrible, but I think they can just be complete waste of money for a lot of people who are just misguided and just
used
being
incorrectly.
Yeah, just being told, oh, take this, take that, or just getting hit with ads of being told to take different things. It's why we don't talk about supplements on this podcast, because it's not something that I can recommend to anybody, just generally speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So question for you. Now that we have a more behind the scenes look at pathways, you mentioned certain hormones being metabolized a different way. What does that mean exactly for the everyday person? Why is that important?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to of now once we know what's happening with your body, we can use specific nutrition and supplement and lifestyle protocols to help solve those issues to get you feeling better, essentially.
Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, so the biggest thing that because to me, I think a lot of this is very much like a puzzle. I've seen the results of a Dutch test and I'm like, there's patterns and graphs and I'm like, what the hell is going on? But I think the biggest one that I've noticed even just with you and your own journey has been the cortisol patterning. If just, sometimes it could be 9, 10 a.m. and you feel exhausted, or sometimes it was 7, 8 o'clock at night. You're like, I am wired, ready to go. So can you share a little bit of just the cortisol stuff that you had to go through and how the Dutch test helped you specifically?
Yeah. So, going back to 2022, when I first dove into the Dutch test, one of the main reasons that led me to want to dive into this type of further testing was because I found myself feeling exhausted. Like I was a absolute caffeine addict. I felt like my brain.
How many cups of coffee were you drinking?
Oh gosh, I don't even know. I vividly remember being on this one trip, this business mastermind, and I remember especially because it was like one of those things where you're sitting in a comfy couch listening to a lot of talks and like just being kind of still, not like moving and not like being go go go. I felt like my brain was just shutting down, and so since we were in a house, they had a pot of coffee going, and I think I drank the entire pot of coffee to myself, and then I had to make a new pot because I just kept like refilling my cup, trying to just stay awake to participate
People were
in this
probably like,
mastermind.
what is wrong with this girl?
But that was where I was at that point of like, I just had this like heavy brain fog. It just felt like I almost had like a filter on my life to where I'm not even like seeing things properly almost. Just feel like my brain, like I always say, it almost feels like your brain's on low battery mode. It's frustrating because you just can't think things through. You like can't come up with the right words. It's really frustrating. That was the biggest thing for me, to where, dealing with the PMS, dealing with some of the gut issues, some of that I was able to be like, whatever, I'll get to that eventually.
Well, I remember at that point too, you were like, I'll just cut this food out, I'll cut this out, and it'll figure itself out.
Yeah,
And
I was just kind of in a place of like, I was able to say, okay, you know what, the health stuff, my body, like, I'll get to that later. It's not that big of a deal. Like, yeah, it sucks having PMS. Yeah, it sucks having these digestive issues, and I don't feel my best, but like, I'll put, I can get to that later. But eventually I got to a place to where my mental health and my mental acuity was affected. And for me as like a business owner, that was not okay. I could not show up to work. I could not show up on a day-to-day basis feeling that way. And so that's what ultimately led me to say, okay, I think maybe there's something going on with my cortisol. Let me look at a Dutch test, because I know that that's actually really the top way to measure your cortisol is in the form of a Dutch test. It's one of the things that they are renowned for. And so with that, really like when we look at what are we talking about here with like the cortisol patterning, right? Mm-hmm. So cortisol is the type of thing where we don't want it to be at the same level all day long. It's more of like a Goldilocks hormone, to where depending on the time of day, there's like a certain amount that we want. We don't want it to be too high or too low. And that like level that we want it at changes over the course of the day. We want it to be highest when we wake up in the morning, because cortisol is a hormone that wakes you up. So it's like you want it to kind of be, I guess actually not its highest, but you want it to be high in the morning. And then it's actually going to slowly peak a little bit to mid-morning. And then it's going to start to taper off from there over the rest of the day and bottom out at its lowest point right before you go to bed. And that's what helps you fall asleep at night. Then it kind of stays low until it starts to rise again towards the end of your sleep. And again, that's when it should theoretically naturally wake you up.
What was yours doing?
Mine on my first test was basically like practically like a straight line across the bottom.
Oh, really? Is that? I remember it was like a stock market. It was like up, down, up, down.
No, that was my second one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like, especially in the early days, I was still kind of learning these types of things. So it took a couple tries. Like I used myself as a guinea pig a little bit before I really learned how to optimize these types of things. But yeah, like that's why I felt exhausted and like I could just sleep all the time, was because my cortisol was so low. Well, now, I've done multiple Dutch tests since then. And nowadays, like I literally just did a Dutch test, just got my results back the other week. And what's funny enough is I found myself kind of this year, at the beginning of the year, or like at a certain point during the year, we kind of had a lot of life stress happening. And with that, I was like, oh man, all this stress. I feel like I'm not managing my stress super well. Yeah. And I was like, I've done so much work on my cortisol. I don't want to set myself backwards. I don't want to end up where I was. And I was worried about that. And then kind of like I would say around the spring, I found myself feeling more and more tired. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it.
Here we go.
I'm back. Like we're heading back down the path. Like I wasn't obviously at that point that I was once at. I don't even hardly drink coffee anymore, but I felt like I was more so starting to like need caffeine a little bit more than want it, and just starting to feel like I felt almost like I could take an afternoon nap, like just feeling more tired than I had been. And so I was worried about this Dutch test. I was like, oh my gosh, cortisol is going to be flatlined. I don't know what I'm like. Oh, this is, it's just, I was anticipating getting some bad news. Well, funny enough, I got that test back, and actually my cortisol was probably the best it's ever looked. The free cortisol graph. So again, looking at like it really can show you over the course of the day what it looks like, because with a Dutch, we're testing at, you take a sample right when you wake up. So first thing, as soon as you wake up, You take a sample again around 10 a.m. or around mid-morning. You take another sample around 5 p.m. And then you take a sample right before you go to bed.
And see, I go to your point too there, as opposed to going to getting labs drawn at one morning where you're fasted or whatever. Like now you have a different picture, different times of the day, different days. And I think it just gives so much more information, so much more data.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of doctors just like won't even pull cortisol, but the ones that do, and that was something that like somebody had messaged me of, I've been feeling like there's something with my cortisol, and I asked my doctor, and he said, we just don't do that here. We don't check that.
Interesting.
And so like a lot of people struggle with even getting their doctor to pull blood work that they want. But the thing is, with something like cortisol, even if you do get it via blood work, kind of like you were saying there, Omar, you're going to get it when you can get it scheduled. So ideally, they're going to probably try and schedule you in the morning because they typically want to see like your cortisol awakening response as best as possible. But it's not the same as testing it like when you do a Dutch test. You wake up, you go to the toilet, and you pee on the thing. And that's literally...
You pee on the thing.
You get the immediate like test results of what is it actually looking like when you wake up, not an hour and a half later when you drove to the doctor's office or the LabCorp and had it pulled.
Okay, so go back to what you were saying though. So you got your test back. You thought, cortisol was going to be flatline. It wasn't. So then tell us a little bit about like what ended up happening.
Yeah, so what actually is super interesting there. So again, I got these results back and I was like, oh my gosh, my cortisol curve is actually like almost perfect here, just looking at the visual even. And I was very, very pleased by that. But at the same time, then I'm like, okay, but wait a second, why do I feel more tired than I have been? Well, here's another mistake that a lot of people make. Typically, we talk a lot about cortisol. We talk about the hormone cortisol. Well, what are we actually referring to? We're referring to free cortisol typically. Again, free cortisol being like that hormone that's free and available in the blood. That's what you would see if you also tested your blood work. Well, free cortisol is actually only like 3 to 5% of what the body really feels. What you're actually going to feel more of is the metabolized cortisol. So when you look at your cortisol metabolites, that can also reveal a lot of information about why you might be feeling the way that you feel. And so when I drilled down even further and I looked at my cortisol metabolites, that showed, okay, actually, my total cortisol, like my actual total cortisol, is actually low. And so that makes sense why I'm a little bit more tired. But it doesn't scare me in the sense of like in the past when I was like, oh my God, my free cortisol is completely bottomed out. I have so much work to do. Now it's just like, oh, all I need is actually a little bit of methylation support to help my body metabolize it better because my body's producing it perfectly. It's just not metabolizing it so that I can feel it well.
Interesting. Got it. Okay. So, and I mean, this goes back to what you were saying earlier is, when people all of a sudden have all these symptoms from Instagram or, Google, whatever, and they're like, oh my gosh, yep, I checked this box, checks this box. It must be this. But in reality, it's something totally different that can be addressed by the right, testing, the right supplementation, the right lifestyle support too, right?
Yeah. Well, even if I was somebody that was just like playing Google Doctor, playing Instagram Doctor, and I'm just going off my symptoms, and I'm like, oh, I'm more tired. My cortisol must be low. Let me take this supplement that's good for low cortisol. And now suddenly I'm finding myself feeling anxious and having panic attacks. Well, guess what? It's because I didn't need that. My free cortisol was in a great spot. What I needed is methylation support. I needed something on like the back end conversion process.
You know what this reminds me of? I feel like my brain is very like analogy based, but did you ever have a box when you were a kid that had the different cutouts and you were supposed to fit like the different shapes to the different, holes or whatever? And it's almost like fitting a square through like a round hole or something, trying to just like hammer into it when it's not the right thing for you.
Yeah.
See, this is how my brain works.
Yeah. And then kind of going back to something you mentioned earlier is so a lot of women will express waking up in the middle of the night, right?
Yeah.
Well, so what's really cool about the Dutch test as well, so I mentioned that we pull those 4 samples across the 4 points of the day, right? Waking up, mid-morning, like late afternoon, and right before you go to bed. Well, if you're somebody who also wakes up during the night, you're actually going to pull a 5th sample, and that's going to show what is your cortisol doing at nighttime.
That specific time.
Yeah, so that can be incredibly helpful for women who are dealing with that because, again, you're not going to be able to check your cortisol with your doctor in the middle of the night. Like, that's just not possible, even if it was helpful to see it in blood work version. So, I mean, I think those are like the main things I want to hit on for the differences between the Dutch test and blood work. There's more stuff I could dive into, and I'm always happy to dive into things further with you guys in the DMs. For those of you who had messaged me about this, I really enjoyed our conversations for sure. But ultimately, I also want to emphasize this podcast is not meant to say that a Dutch test is the end all be all and you should never get blood work. No, blood work still has a time and a place. It's incredibly beneficial. You absolutely should be still getting regular blood work done with your doctor. If you have health insurance, you have no reason not to. And especially, it can be a great place to start for people. But if you are finding yourself in a position where you are feeling a certain way that you don't want to feel, you're struggling to lose weight, you have PMS, like whatever it is, and your blood work is showing as normal, then we need to dive deeper. And that's where a Dutch test is one of the types of tests that we like to dive into deeper with our clients. And then at the same time too, again, blood work is really beneficial because there are certain things that we prefer to look at in blood. So like typically we'll do a full thyroid panel via blood work, or testosterone is actually advantageous to look at via blood. So like, for example, we just had a client that we got back her Dutch test and everything was actually looking pretty good, especially for, being a late 30s female, hadn't gone through a lot of life stress. Like we could tell the things that she'd been doing had been really working for her. But why is she still experiencing some fatigue? Why is she still not quite feeling optimal? Well, that's when we actually were able to dive in and see, there's actually a little bit of a conversion issue here on the Dutch test that is pointing to, like, we're suspecting that there's probably actually something from the thyroid that's causing that. So next, let's actually order a full thyroid panel and see what's going on with the thyroid. And that's something we want to do via blood work.
Yeah. I mean, it's a puzzle at the end of the day, and you have to get different viewpoints, different, perspectives on things to be able to figure out the best way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you are interested in ordering a Dutch test, that is something that we do for our clients. At this point in time, we don't do that externally, and that's really just because it's not ultimately going to be beneficial for you. The benefit in the labs is the actual ability for a trained practitioner to review and read and understand and interpret your results and create protocols off of it and continue to update those protocols based on how your body is actually responding. So just getting the test done isn't ultimately going to be that beneficial for you. It can be helpful, but it's not that beneficial, and that's why now we don't offer it in that way.
It's what you do with the results, the protocols, the right implementation, essentially.
Exactly. So you're welcome to message me if that's something you want to learn more about, of what that would look like. But in the meantime, I would encourage you, share this podcast. I think this is the type of information that needs to get out there more. So send this to a friend. Tell them, hey, are you familiar with the Dutch test? You need to learn more about it. Check out this podcast and send it, share it on your story. Let people know about what a Dutch test is so we can actually give people quality education that they can move forward with. But thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Bye, everybody.